Why might you want to do regression? That is maybe not an unimportant question, since much of this course is about regression, and specifically linear regression. So reasons for doing regression include you want an explanation. By explanation, we mean how they're explaining the relationship between the x's and the y's. So the explaining how the x's affect the y's. A second reason might be prediction, and a third reason might be outlier detection or unusual observations. And so in the next little while, we'll talk about each of those in turn. Number one, explanation. So for example, if you have a month-over-month return for the S&P 500 stock index and IBM from January 2001 to March 2003. So we have monthly returns here, and you're asking yourself, is there a relationship between the returns? We look at the data. So, well, we think there is a relationship, right? Because as the S&P return increases, so does, on average, the IBM return also increase. Below, there's some Stata code, which you can ignore if you don't use Stata. On the next slide, there's some R code if you can ignore if you don't use R. So you can look at that in more detail if you like. So that's explanation. So here we see how this X variable relates to the Y variable, in this case, IBM here, stock price of IBM. Next possible reason why you want to do regression is prediction. For example, you might want to determine the market value of unsold properties based on the values of similar properties. And the explanatory variables here may be the size of the property, the age of the house on the property, the building land ratio, location, and all kinds of other variables like that. And then you use the model to predict the market value for the houses that are not included in the model. And if you have many explanatory variables, then the question arises of model building. Which of the variables are relevant and explain some variation in Y, and which are not? So that is a second example, or a second reason to do regression. And the third one is outlier detection. An outlier is an unusual observation, and we will talk about that a little more because there's different ways one can define unusual. But suppose you're looking at overhead costs for offices. You have service organizations with 24 offices, and there's an auditor, and the auditor can't actually check every single number. They just want to look at things that are unusual. So the auditor assesses overhead costs for offices, and they can't just pick the largest one, the largest overhead cost, because, well, a larger office with more employees and with a bigger building probably also has larger overhead cost. So you need to adjust for some variables, which in this case might be measures of size, like the number of employees. And so to do that, you can do a regression analysis and find the observations that are unusual, for example, in the sense that they have a very large residual, right? Because if the regression line represents the average given the values of your axis, and to the extent that you are above or below the average, the average on the regression line by a lot, then there would be an outlier. All right. These were the three reasons, and this completes this section.